Evening, everyone. Hello. So, not quite over, but it's pretty much over. And we've had, well, all of the major parties have had the chance to get their messages out. So, what I wanted to do is I wanted to just have a little look at some of them. Something interested me about the conferences. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put up in a moment. Chris has said that I wonder how many high points there are. I suppose that might depend on your point of view. I mean, if you were someone who takes the Tory media seriously, you would think the Conservative conference was an absolute triumph. Triumph it was. Apparently, all the delegates had stealth suits, though, because to my uneducated eyes, the seats looked largely empty. But never mind that. I'm going to put up in a moment what I think. Now, you can correct me if you think I've got something wrong. What I think are their main themes. So so obviously at these party conferences, the top people all have a little area. Like Labour, it would be actual ministers, but it's also shadow ministers, but also just people who have the brief for a particular policy area, right? So you'll have speeches on energy, you'll have speeches on business, you'll have speeches on the economy, on education, on health, blah, 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 right? But there's usually a couple of themes running through them because it's like what I say at an election time. During an election, parties have got like 100 policies, right? But they can only get out about 5 messages, give or take. Labour pushed the boat out and tried 6 during last year's general election. But you can't, what I'm saying is, you can't really amplify very many policies, so you have to focus on your top ones. It's a little bit like that with a conference, only probably fewer, because your conference mostly is for your members, of course, but you also know it's going to be reported on in the news. And actually for smaller parties that usually struggle to get breakthrough in the news, because the news will only really report on Labour, the Conservatives and Reform UK. They, like the rest, might as well not exist most of the time. So you're going to get reported on. So this is your chance. But you can only afford a couple of key things to shine through. So if you just presented all your messages, you're allowing the journalists to pick what they want to talk about. So what you need to do is keep repeating what you want to get out there. So here's what I reckon are the key themes that came up. And I chose these based on what seemed to come up in speech after speech after speech, and looking at each party's website and stuff like that. What were the messages they particularly wanted to push? Now, if you think I've got any of these slightly wrong, by all means say so. But I noticed something interesting, and I want to see if anyone else did. So let me just go down. Putting A to the end, I'm still confident in my Kemi bet. I will be until it's completely unwinnable. She's probably going to last this year. Because I think Kemi Badenoch, if I was a Tory, why would you get rid of her now? Because whoever replaces her will then have to take the hit on the elections next year. I mean, obviously every year you've got local elections, but you've also got the Senedd and Holyrood elections next year. You'd let her take the fall for those and then get someone new in. So you wouldn't have the leadership contest going on while that election campaign's going on. You'd clear it, then you'd trigger it. Then you'd blame her for it, and then you'd get rid of her. So she's gone next year, I'm telling you. But anyway, let's go down. So Labour, living standards and growth was their things. Again, the themes that kept coming up through different speeches. Because remember, all of the speeches have to be cleared by the leadership in any party. Of course they do. But usually what the leadership will say is, we want to particularly push this. It's a little bit like when I was a teacher, working in college. You'd sometimes be told, okay, this year we want to have a really strong focus on this particular soft skill. Like it might be oracy or literacy or, in theory, numeracy, but you didn't usually do that much because then the art teachers would be buggered. But same thing here. So the leadership will sort of say, we want you to particularly focus on this theme because this is the message we want to get out. So Labour, I thought it was living standards and growth. Tories, austerity and skin whitening. Lib Dems, climate and social care. The Greens, housing and tax reform. Reform UK, the fact we shouldn't have foreigners in the country. The SNP independence, that was something that went through everything. That was their big thing. And Plaid Cymru, childcare and education. Right? So those are what I would think. Now, again, remember, who are the conferences for? Who are these messages for? The conferences are for the members, the party faithful. But the messages, your coordinated messages, your stage managed messages, they're for the wider population because they're what you want the news to report on, right? That's what you want the journalists to focus on. That's why you manage and you sort of say, these are the messages we want you to keep repeating so that it inevitably gets in there. And I'll tell you something, and this might tell us something about the state of politics, something I thought was interesting. Chris there saying, I feel I agree with all but one of those takeaways. The takeaway from Labour was taking the fight to reform. So that's a different thing. That's party politics, right? So what I mean is in terms of policy, I mean the things that are theirs, that they're going to do, right? Labour are not in government to like stop Reform UK. They're in government to make lives better. Well, every party thinks it's in government to make lives better for everyone else, right? So in terms of attacking other parties, they all do that. They will all attack their main rivals. The SNP, for example, was a very strong anti-Labour thing in it, right? Same with the Green Party. But that's just party politics. You obviously will spend some of that time attacking your main rivals. I'm talking about what's them, not the other. What's them, right? The policies they really wanted to put. So I noticed something interesting. I'll see if you do it. If I point out Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens. Labour, Lib Dems and the Greens. Unless you think I've got them very wrong. Right? I'll tell you what I find fascinating. So at the election, one of the big things Labour were pushing, like absolutely massive thing they were pushing, in fact, for several years, in fact, for the whole of the last Parliament, basically, but certainly in the build-up to the election, one of the big things they were pushing was green technology, transitioning to green technology. Remember, they'd originally planned huge levels of investment into it. They had to cut it down a bit after it got a load of grief in the media, but nonetheless there was a really strong focus on what you might call climate policies, but green technology. It was from an economic point of view mostly, but nonetheless green technology. Now they're still committed to it, of course. There's green GB Energy is already a thing. They've already nationalised part of the national grid. They haven't toned down any of their plans to transition to clean energy. But it was Ed Miliband flying the flag for it because that's his job. It wasn't one of the main themes in the conference. Then you've got the Green Party. And I know it might sound like an obvious thing, but why wasn't green energy or just climate change in general the big one of the big umbrella policies for the Green Party? Was it because they thought, well, with the Green Party, obviously people take it for granted? Or is there something that the Green Party and Labour know about their voters that's a bit different? Because what I found interesting, stood out like a sore thumb to me, the Lib Dems, we know Ed Davey's making a big thing of social care, so it was no surprise that there was a huge amount of emphasis on social care in the Lib Dem conference. But climate, huge. It was really noticeable how often they talked about that, and they brought that into various other policy areas, but not Labour or the Green Party. David there saying, I'd argue the green transition still a priority, has just been rebranded. Oh no, I'm not saying it's not a priority, and I'm not saying it's not a priority for the Green Party. What I'm saying is, because remember what these messages are not their priorities. These messages are what they think their voters' priorities are, right? It's because these are the messages they want to get out to the public. Why does a political party want to get a message out to the public? So the public will support them. So what messages do you prioritise? The ones you think will gather the most support from your target voters. Now, I have said before, I'm not convinced that Zach Polanski knows who his target voters are, but nonetheless, he has an idea in mind, doesn't he? Right? Isn't it interesting that the Greens think that the thing that would most get voters to appeal to them is housing and tax reform, and for Labour, living standards and growth, and neither case is climate, but for the Lib Dems it is. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Lib Dems, of course, have very different voters. The Lib Dems are actually really weird as a party. They're unique. In all of these 7 parties, they are completely unique in that they're not really competing with anyone right now. Not many people, anyway. Because the Lib Dems have a particular type of voter in mind, and they target the seat. Like Ed Davey's done really well strategically in that he's not wasted his time trying to attract wasted votes around the country. He's focused on the areas he can win, and it's obviously worked really well for him, and looks like it will continue to do so. The latest MRP poll did have the Lib Dems not just holding on to their seats, but making net gains. Not saying they held on to all their seats, but they made net gains. They at the next election could well win even more seats. So they'd be into completely uncharted territory. But they're not really, they traditionally compete with the Conservatives. They don't compete with Labour at all. Well, in Scotland, a little bit of competition with Labour and the SNP, but not a huge amount nationally. They compete with the Conservatives, but the Conservatives are uncompetitive at the moment. So the Lib Dems effectively aren't in a fight with anyone. Labour are in a fight with Reform UK and the SNP for the Senate elections next year, also with Plaid. The Tories are in they're not even competitive. Let's leave them out. The Greens are in a fight mostly with Labour. The SNP are in a fight mostly with Labour, and Plaid are in a fight with Reform UK and Labour. So every one of those parties has someone there. The Tories are competing with like everyone, but not very well. But I thought that was quite interesting. Chris there saying, I'm confused. When I look online for what was discussed at the Labour conference, policy wasn't really mentioned. It was talking about the fight to reform. So that was a theme through everything as well. But that's not a policy. There were also they didn't spend their entire speeches talking about Reform UK. The Reform UK was mentioned in every speech because you're right, it is a message that Labour wanted to get out, but it's not a policy. I'm focusing on policy messages here. Policy. What are the policy areas? Because that doesn't get people to vote for you. Well, it might a little bit. Okay, yeah. If there's people who want to vote against Reform UK, but if people want to vote against Reform UK, they'd be best advised to vote for whoever is the best place to beat Reform UK in their constituency, which isn't always going to be Labour. It might mostly be. But these messages are there for this is what we're going to give you. It's the offer. It's the offer to their voters. And the only party that thinks that climate is a sufficiently strong offer for their voters is the Lib Dems. Now, it is possible that some of these parties are not correctly reading their target voters. That's entirely possible. You've got to remember as well, small parties to be honest, they can't actually afford to accurately gauge their voters. So like the Green, when I say about Polanski, I don't think he knows who his voters are. First of all, he's a new leader, so he's only just got his hands on the machinery of the party. But secondly, they don't get enough in donations. It's actually very complicated to identify key target voters. It's very expensive. It costs a lot of money. If I give you an example, I'll probably use this at some point because I think this is going to be a theme over the next few years. So in 1997, when the Tories lost the previous time, and they floundered under William Hague, and it wasn't because William Hague was an idiot. And senior Tories from the time explained years later why it was that they were constantly out of touch with the public. It's not because William Hague was an imbecile. it was actually quite clever and strategic. It's because they couldn't afford for the analysis of because you've got to think about it this way. You've got to identify your key voters. That's actually really incredibly complicated because you can only afford one or two types of key voter. Because you can't, like, there's loads of different types. These days there's even more. It's worse than in 1997. There's more types of voter now than there were even then. And you can't appeal to all of them. So you've got to like pick your battles effectively. You've got to identify. So who do you identify as your key voter? Well, it has to be someone who, in enough seats that you're wanting to target, is going to choose between you and the person who will eventually otherwise win. That's very expensive to do. You can't do that just from the sort of random polls that people publish. Even MRP polls can't tell you that very well, right? Then when you've identified that, you need to constantly be asking those voters what they think about various policy issues. You're constantly polling them. It's very expensive because it's targeted polling. It's targeted polling costs more. So the Green Party probably can't accurately identify their target voters. So they will be flying a little bit blind. The other parties will have a bit more in terms of, like, the SNP implied don't, but they've got a smaller electorate as well, right? So it's quite tricky. But if we assume they're not a million miles out from identifying their target voters, this is what they think are their key points. And I just find it interesting that the Lib Dems think that their key voters are interested in climate issues to the point where it's a top issue. And they may be right, because, like I said, the reason why it's therefore not reflected in the other parties is possibly because they are targeting a particular type of voter that no one else is. In theory, the Conservatives should be, but they're not, because they are actually cocking everything up. Dominic Grieve has spoken about the Tory party post-1997. They were flailing around for 5 to 7 years. Yeah, and there's several people from the time. He wasn't senior at the time, but people who were senior at the time had said some years later it's because their donations had dried up to the point they couldn't afford the detailed analysis, the data science, because it's not cheap. Saying Polanski is very ambitious, much more than Caroline Lucas. I would say wait and see. He may just talk a good game. We will see. I think you have to give someone a good year to see which direction they're going in, unless they actually say what direction they want to go in. And even then, you still see which direction they're actually going in. Callum, they say, I'm writing on migration policy for a political committee. I'm thinking that a combined approach of social and eco policies which address the cost of living, but with national security at its core. Again, who would that be for, though? Because, again, if I look at this, and it's not a hugely scientific approach, but all of these parties have chosen those messages with care. Again, unless someone thinks I've gotten one of those things wrong. But those are what sort of shone out to me like a beacon. So those are the ones that they think are their shop windows, shall we say, the main things. Like, living standards for the party of government makes sense, whoever the party is, because obviously people tend not to vote out a government that's raising their standard of living. You tend to vote out a government when your standard of living drops. So obviously that one. But Labour also emphasising the growth there, which I thought was an odd one, because I'm not sure that is as big a seller. But they think it is, right? And they do, I mean, okay, their donations may have dropped compared to last year, but they still have the money to poll. Tories thinking austerity and skin whitening. I know I'm putting that a little bit glib, but at the end of the day, seriously, what other message came out? You had austerity, that was throughout Mel Stride's speech and Kemi Badenoch's speech, right? Austerity. Their focus was not on growing the economy, their focus was on cutting expenditure. And then Robert Jenrick's, racism bit. that was also a theme from others as well. There's others that push. They weren't as openly racist as he was, but they were pushing similar things. Former music saying there, around 6 in 10 adults, 59%, reported that their cost of living has increased in the last month. This proportion has been declining since April 2025, but remains higher than June 2024, 51%. Yes, I mean this is why Labour very desperately are going to want to make sure that energy bills come down. That's going to be one of their main foci, because in actual fact, living standards have been increasing in terms of figures on the graph. Do you know what I mean? That obviously isn't how people feel it. Because what do people feel? Well, we know this from the American election. I know it's a different electorate, but it's still human psychology, isn't it? What do people focus on when it comes to the cost of living? Do they sit down? How many people, in all honesty, even in the chat, sit down with a spreadsheet of their income and outgoings and compare it with the year before? No one. I'm numerate, right? And I like my spreadsheets. I've never done that. I don't even do it now. And I do plot my expenditure now because I have to make sure I can pay my taxes, right? Because I no longer have tax automatically deducted from me at source. So I have to make sure that I do track my expenditure. But I still don't compare it with a year ago. Very few people are going to do that. So how do people measure the cost of living? Cost of things, doesn't it? If they see the cost of things going up, which remember it always does. There's when was the last time we had zero inflation? But if people perceive that things are always going up, then they think their standard of living is going down. Of course they do. So that's what Labour have to tackle in terms of living standards. They need to make sure people's living standards do go up in reality, but they also, and Labour have said this, they need to make sure that people feel it. And how are they going to feel it? They need to see bills coming down, frankly. So if they can do what they want to do and say, right, your energy bills are 300 quid cheaper than they were at the last election. If at the next election they can say, we promised your energy bills would be 300 quid cheaper and they're 300 quid cheaper, then that's the sort of thing that will cut through. Case there saying Green Party have quite a big presence where I live, mostly DFLs who own their own home, so young middle class vote for them. So yes, but it's also those younger middle class that tend to be more climate conscious as well. But that is also not necessarily their target voter. Your target voter isn't the same as your core voter. It's different. Your core voter are the ones who are going to reliably vote for you. Your target voters are the ones that you can persuade to vote for you, but you have to work for it. And even then, of course, you still wouldn't target them unless they are a key swing voter in a seat you need to win. Puneta there saying, I do track my finances very closely. You're an oddity then, which is how I know my cost of living has decreased massively since the election, granted a promo and pay boost more than government policy. Yeah, well, but that's what I mean. Like, in terms of the figures on the graph, we know, for example, that people on the minimum wage, their income, well, assuming they're full-time, their income has gone up above the increase in the cost of living. I can't account for rent because this is based on CPI inflation, doesn't include rents. That will obviously depend. Some people's rents have gone up in the last year, some people's haven't. The last time I rented, my landlord, I lived there for, it was about 6 years, and the rent went up once. It went up once in 6 years, and even then, it was up by a relatively small amount, and even then the landlord apologised for having to put it up. Whereas some landlords put their rent up every year if they can get away with it, right? So we can't really account for that too well. But by and large, that's gone up. So have people in public sectors, so have people on pensions. We also know that the energy cost, although in the news it's talking about energy costs rising this winter, it's rising by, for some people it's actually lowering, but for the people it is rising. It's rising by £35 a year. It's like less than £3 a month. And last winter, it was lower than the winter before, but there was no mention made of that in the news. Wellinger Peggy then saying, I've already felt an easing to my own cost of living. I know plenty of others who feel the same. Haven't had to use a food bank since just before the Tories left office. Well, that's always good, isn't it? But I do take the point. Sorry, I've lost it. I'm going to have to find it again now. Sorry, where is it? Is it Dave? Maid? Someone? No, sorry, Fulmer Music. That a majority are reporting the cost of living has increased in the last month. Now, what will be interesting with that poll is exactly who that is, right? But it's a majority, so it's still not good. You need, and the reason why it's not good, because I say it doesn't matter whether it covers your key voters or not. Obviously, if your key voters feel things are improving, that's strategically what's most important. But you also want a majority to feel it's improving, because if a majority think that their cost of living is improving, as in going down, then they're more likely to talk about that with others, and then that sort of feeds in, because people are sheeple, right? A lot of people's view of the world is not based on their observations of the world, but on what other people say. There's a lot of people like that. People are sheeple, right? So what you want is a lot of people to be able to say undeniably the cost of living is going down. And the cost of food is never going to go down. You can hope that it doesn't carry on rising too much, but it's never going to go down. So you ideally don't want, so you want something big. So what are the two key drivers of inflation at the moment? Food costs, you're not going to get them to go down. You might get them to stop going up so much, but you're not going to get them to go down. And the other one is energy. Well, the government can make that go down. And there's several ways they can do it. At the moment, they're trying to work out politically the tidiest way to do it. Right? Obviously, once we've made the transition to clean energy, we no longer peg the cost of energy to gas, at which point it will come down anyway. But let's say Labour have to force it down before the election, right? Some people's bills will be going down next year. I've said before, there is a policy from next year, from 2026, people who live within 500 metres of a pylon will get discounts on their energy bills. So there is already going to be some reduction of energy bills next year, but that's not going to be universal. What Labour would ideally like, well, if I was advising them, I would say it doesn't have to be universal. It just has to be in all the places you can win, right? All the seats you think you can win. Obviously, you can't do it on a constituency by constituency basis, and that would be deeply corrupt if you tried. But you can do it by regions. But the easy way to do it by region, which Ed Miliband was looking at, Downing Street cock blocks. They said, no, you're not doing that. Because it would have made bills cheaper for virtually the entire country. But not people in the southeast, their bills would have gone up. So I would have taken it, though. I would have said, well, at least let's investigate this, because Labour aren't going to win that many seats in the southeast, whereas it would have meant lower bills very quickly. It could have been implemented quite quickly in the North Midlands, Wales, the north of England and Scotland. But maybe they think they've got a better plan. And I suppose they could always pull that out of the back pocket later on, couldn't they? Speaking of rent, my landlord aunt is trying to sell her 7 rentals due to the new legislation, which will cripple her, but she doesn't have anyone willing to buy due to the state. What, due to the state of the houses? Shouldn't she have looked after them better then? I would ask what new legislation. I mean, I assume you mean the Renters' Rights Bill, but what legislation seriously is going to because it's a bit like the Employment Rights Bill, right? The Employment Rights Bill doesn't actually impose greater costs on employers, unless those employers haven't really been treating their workers like people. Because a lot of employers will look through the Employment Rights Bill and go, well, we already do this. They'll have to update their policies to reflect the law like you always do, but they already do it anyway. Same with Renters' Rights Bill. I haven't seen anything in the Renters' Rights Bill that I think back to my last landlord, who was a good landlord, right? I haven't read anything in the Renters' Rights Bill that I'd have thought to myself would have made any change to me as a renter like 5 years ago. Yes, due to the state of the building, and yes to the Renters' Rights Bill. She's a terrible landlord and person in general. Well, there you go. My sympathy drains away. I'm afraid, at that one. A problem with the £35 a year increase is it is average. Those in less efficient houses, larger families, those with medical conditions, see them increase more than 35. Yes, that is true. You're right. That is based on the standard cap, indeed. But again, I mean, something else Labour are doing that the Conservatives instantly stopped after the last Labour government they're putting in again. You talk about efficiency. Yes, Labour are also insulating houses again. But also, thinking about it purely strategically, which cynically, shall we say cynically strategically? I could probably get rid of this now, I think, unless someone had a comment on it. Thinking about it cynically strategically, right. So, if you're going to, let's say you've got this plan that allows you to reduce energy bills. All right, let me put it really plainly. Let's say I were an advisor in number 10 Downing Street, right? Let's say I was an advisor, or in the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, right? Doesn't matter. Let's say I was a senior advisor, okay? And we had this meeting one day, and someone comes in saying, I've got this brilliant plan. We could cut energy bills by £300 tomorrow, right? Do you know what I would advise them to do? Sit on it for a couple of years. If I was being a cynical strategic advisor, I would say, if you cut energy bills, I'm not saying, by the way, Labour have this thing ready to go and they're holding on to it. I'm just saying if they did, I would advise them to hold on to it. And I know that sounds, it is cynical. But if you cut energy bills now, then they're cut and the people take them for granted. And then come the next election, what have you got? I'm just going to look something up. Sorry, hold on. Let me find. Whereas, if you cut them 2 years out, then, first of all, if it's taken you 3 years to do it, you can say, but we had to do this, 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 and this. So you're showing what you did, right? You put all these things in place, and you're also helping sort of explain to voters, these things take time, but we are doing it. So that helps you with your next campaign. But also it's fresher in the mind when the election rolls around, where if you do it 4 years out, it's no longer, like, for example, first thing Labour did, right? They raised public sector pay. The minimum wage obviously only took effect this year, but they announced it straight away that minimum wage was going to go up, not just up, but up in real terms, which hasn't really happened for a bit. Well, occasionally it does happen, but they it was quite a hefty boost to the minimum wage. Are they getting any credit for that? No, because that was a year ago. They were getting credit for it a year ago. Ironically, they didn't get any credit for it even when it happened, because the public sector pay thing happened very quickly. The minimum wage thing was announced quickly, but it didn't actually take place until this April. By which time, people had forgot, even when it's in their pay packet, people were obviously aware of it. Punator there going, Punator clearly doesn't like his auntie. For reference, she tried to get a schoolboy removed from primary for being trans. He wasn't trans, but Scottish, homesick, and was wearing a kilt on non-uniform day. What's wrong with this woman? Jack's there saying maximum impact is important. It is. Unfortunately, politics is really very cynical. As I say, I'm not saying Labour could cut energy bills by £300 tomorrow. Because actually, if they could, do you know what I would actually say? Cut it by £100, then next year cut it by another £100, then the following year cut it by another £100. So you'd have a constant thing of energy bills coming down each year. So I'd maybe say that, so that you portion it out. You don't do it, if you're going to deliver something really good, you don't do it straight away. And then, like, for example, Labour aren't going to get any credit at all including from me in all honesty, for that boost to public sector pay and minimum wage if it was just that year and we don't get it again. You know, I want to be able to show, and this is why I'm just going to look something up. I'm just going to try and find something. I may have to do a bit of a calculation. A phased approach would prevent trust inflation we got from energy price guarantee. Yeah, well, yes, there is that. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? If you increase people's spending power, you increase inflation. There's like, so I mean, someone already mentioned stagflation. So if you have stagflation, that means you've got a stagnant economy, so the economy is fairly flat, which means in all likelihood, on average, people's incomes are not really growing. But you've also got high inflation, worst of all worlds. Usually you have one or the other. Usually if your economy is growing, then, you know, people on average are doing better, so they spend more. Inflation goes up. Bank of England, or whichever central bank, but ours is Bank of England, puts up interest rates. Specifically to stop you spending quite so much. They're saying you're spending too much. Can you calm down, lads? And then you sort of go into reverse. Then let me just have a look at something. I'm trying to find something. Got to log in. So this may take me a little moment. I just want to check something out. 407. So basically, I'm just looking at some data. So going back to the 2010 election. So we know what happened. Labour last won that Labour government, the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown government, won in 2005, right? And then they lost in 2010. What was one of the major factors for the loss? There were a few factors, but the major factor surely was the global crash. If we had not had that financial crash, there's a good chance Labour could have won that election. They may still not have done. They would still have been in power for 13 years. Gordon Brown, still not a great campaigner, but they may still have won, right? They would have had a really good chance. So, do people vote because their living standards are dropped? Yes, their living standards are dropped compared with the financial crash. But I'm just looking here, the median disposable income in 2010, so when they went to the polls, when they went to the election in 2010, their disposable income was higher, I think, only a little bit higher. Actually, inflationary terms, probably not. Let me just have a little look. But what I'm saying is, in terms of the figures, there was no great people were not actually worse off over the course of that parliament. What had happened was, because Labour were growing people's standard of living, they were growing this is disposable income I'm focusing on here, not, you know, so that takes various things into account. So in terms of their disposable income, let me just have a look. Just need to get a figure here. 33,089. Yeah, so in real terms, it would have gone down a little bit, but in money terms, it wouldn't have done. But anyway, David, I say not after Bigot-gate. See, yeah, I mean that was careless. That's not, yeah, always. I couldn't believe that such an experienced politician would fall for that. Like, I remember, was it Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister? Yes Prime Minister where even then it was talking about the fact you should always assume every microphone is live. Always assume that you're being recorded if you're out and about and not in a completely private setting. Always assume you're being recorded. How did Gordon Brown, who surely must have watched those programs, not learn that lesson? Say Gordon Brown was much better as Chancellor than he was as PM. See, I thought he was a good Prime Minister. The most important job of a Prime Minister, of course, ultimately, which is again cynical, but it is the fact, is to win the next election. And that he wasn't great at. But at the same time, it has to be said, if you've been in power for 13 years and there's been a big recession, you're probably going to struggle no matter how good you are. But it didn't help that he wasn't a good campaigner. But anyway. Viv, they're saying, to be hard, it's really hard to guard your tongue every minute of the day. I'm not sure it is, you know. I can understand why you could think so. But I would say this. So as a teacher, I had a similar thing going on, right? Because do you know what so when I started my teacher training, so I went on a teacher training course after my degree. And I remember the day when I had to start doing teaching practice. So you spent about 6 weeks doing theory at the university. Then you start going out into practice, well, it's a real school, but you're a trainee teacher, right? So you're going to do practice lessons. And do you know what my biggest fear was? So when I'd gone to university, I was exposed to a lot of effing and blinding to the point where I ended up doing monkey see, monkey do. So I used to swear a lot, right? And I thought, I cannot, as a teacher, even let one F-bomb out. And I was swearing far too casually while I was at university. And I was thinking, I'm not, because I was thinking that you can't control what you say all the time. You can't control what you say all the time. Something's going to slip out and I'll be knackered, right? And it never did. It never did. Ever. And it's because in a different setting, your brain clearly, I'm not a psychologist, but I switched into a different mode. I even talked differently. When I'm teaching, I speak differently. It's like, some people have a telephone manner. It's like that, right? So there's a bit of, so I was like, I came across differently. I had a different pattern of speech. I had, and it just switched off. And I don't see any reason why if a teacher can do that, a politician can't. It's just, you're different in a different setting. Jack says, I swear a lot, but I watch myself with my 4-year nephew. But you can't, in a different setting, you can do. Like, for example, right, if I'm out and about, and let's say I'm on the high street or something, and I want to cross the road, and there's no cars coming, I cross the road. If I see a child, I always, let's say there's a crossing, and I'm not going to press the button because it's like clear, I'll just cross across. If I see a child, I never do that. I always wait and I cross when the green man, because there's me imagining that their parents talking about the importance of only crossing when the green man is there. And I don't want to undermine their teaching of their child, right? So again, you're conscious of settings. A politician can be conscious of settings. If Blair was still in power, I think he could have won the 4th election. I'm not sure. I've sometimes thought that myself and sometimes thought not. I think the party were ready for him to go. Like there was already some infighting going on in Labour, but that's largely because the polls said they were going to lose the election, right, which they did. I think Blair would have been pushing it, not least from Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown was itching for him to resign from like May 1997. basically, as soon as Tony Blair was confirmed as Prime Minister, the first thing that happened to Tony Blair when he came back from the palace was Gordon Brown said to him, right, when are you resigning, Tony? Right? So I don't think he could have carried on any longer. But he was a better campaigner. But I also wonder if maybe the public was sick of him then as well. In theory, it did Labour no harm at all to refresh the leadership. The issue was, well, another issue was that Gordon Brown was not Tony Blair's Chancellor. Gordon Brown was a fairly unique Chancellor in that part of their pact was that Brown would have carte blanche say over economic policy, that Blair wouldn't interfere with it at all. Every decision on the economy was Brown's. So they were like twin emperors, really. Tony Blair had the title of Prime Minister, but a Prime Minister can overrule a Chancellor, and occasionally they have to. Whereas the deal was that Blair wouldn't do that. He wouldn't ever overrule Brown on economic policy, which is, of course, your most important policy. I think, for example, Blair was quite keen on joining the euro, which may have saved us Brexit if he had. Although the biggest thing to have saved Brexit that he should have done is electoral reform, of course. Pete's Music, they're saying, Phil, I was teaching for a while, electrical engineering. Know what you mean, you have a mask. Ah, well, you may have done then. I am actually going to say that might be a slight exception, though. When I worked in an FE college one time, I worked like teaching maths and science, but I occasionally taught maths to some of the vocational groups. And in the engineering block, they were a law unto themselves, because the engineering lecturers there did F and blind and they don't mind their students doing it. They would just tell them to turn it off if someone official came in. So you may have behaved yourself teaching electrical engineering. My experience, admittedly of just one FE college, was that at least, see, the engineers had their own building and everything. They were like in a little enclave. So they were basically their own little tiny little sovereign nation. But yeah, they did not behave themselves. When's the second King's speech, by the way? So it's not been announced. It is expected to be, I think, next May-ish. So they obviously, you end your session of Parliament once you've finished all the legislative programme. So it's not a set date. It's like once you've finished your legislation, because obviously if you close Parliament to start a new session, if you prorogue Parliament to start a new session, all of the existing legislation gets chucked in the, if it's still going on, it gets chucked in the bin, right? So you have to make sure you get all that through. But I think the expectation is that the next session will begin next May, or yeah, they may actually prorogue it over the local elections. I don't know. Tony Blair issue was Iraq. Iraq was a big one. Yeah. Yeah. But I think even without that, I mean, remember, he did win the election after it. I think even without that, you know, he'd been Prime Minister, when he stood down, he'd been Prime Minister for 10 years. He'd been Labour leader for more. You know, familiarity breeds contempt at the end of the day. And the other thing as well, in government, you are going to piss people off, because everything you do, you know, is intended to like appeal to some people, but it's going to piss others off. So yeah, it does no harm just to, you'd have to have someone really exceptional. I think in British politics, you'd have to be quite exceptional to realistically try and go beyond then. Even going for 10 years is pushing it. I don't think it'd even be possible this time. I mean, like, if you take Keir Starmer, for example, let's say he wins the next election and he wins the majority. I don't see him leading Labour into the next one. And that's, at this point, you can't see anything that far in the future. But I really don't see it, because, you know, I just don't think people are, it's just too fragmented. You need to shake things up and almost keep reinventing yourself. My friend's daughter 7 swears like a docker, and she, the mum, thinks this is hilarious. and I'm talking effing and the C-bomb on a regular basis. Cringe every time I hear it. Yeah, it's not. Yeah, see, she's not doing her kid any good there. I appreciate how a parent might say, or they might believe, well, I don't think words are offensive in themselves. It's the meaning of them that creates the offence and stuff. But you're actually screwing that kid over, because that kid's going to get into trouble at school. And remember, what is the purpose of a school? It's not schools being anal about it. The schools are there to prepare you for the workplace, and there's plenty of workplaces where they'll actively encourage that sort of behaviour. But that's fine. It's much easier to go from being polite to being, colourful in your language than it is to go the other way around. So yeah. Putting into that saying, yeah, leader since '94, I believe, yes. You want to hear very colourful language, go backstage for a night, as theatre staff can swear for the world and then so I'm not surprised. Have I heard that the UK Gini coefficient has gone down this year? Pity it's not a good measure really now. At the end of the day, it really comes down to this. Keir Starmer said it himself, which it's one of the best things he said in PMQs as Prime Minister. They're going to measure the economy by how people feel it. Because I'll tell you something. So going back to the conferences, something interesting from Labour's conference that I noticed when I read through, I didn't watch the speeches, but I read through the transcripts. They could have boasted, I mean, I've done in my videos, haven't I? It is a fact. We've had growth in every quarter since Labour came to power. I'm not saying that will happen every quarter going on, but we have had it so far. So they could have said we've had, and that's the longest period of sustained growth literally in years. They could have said that. They could have boasted about, what could they boast about? Longest sustained period of growth in years. The highest business confidence according to the Lloyd's survey since 2015, right? Real terms increases in pay. They could have actually reeled off quite a few economic triumphs, really, if you wanted to sell it. And yet they didn't. And I'm wondering if the reason they didn't is because when Starmer said last year, our priority is the economy and we will measure it according to how people feel it in their pockets. When he said that, I'm wondering if they mean it. I hope they do mean it, by the way, but I'm wondering if they do, because in terms of measuring the economy according to graphs and charts, there's already a lot they can boast about, and they haven't done. Labour are not behaving as if they've already turned the economy around, and they could hype that, and they haven't. And I'm wondering if that is because they genuinely do mean to use as their metric percentage of people who feel things are better. Maybe that's what they're going to do for their metric, not graphs produced by economists, but polls produced about public opinion. John saying, has Burnham and Jenrick clipped their own wings? I think Burnham has. Interesting you say about Jenrick. So Jenrick also went into the conference wanting to be anointed the prodigal son, right? I saw reports suggesting that Robert Jenrick actually learned from Andy Burnham's mistake. So Andy Burnham went to that conference just to whine at Starmer every time someone put a microphone in front of his face, right? Whereas Robert Jenrick apparently was going around praising Kemi Badenoch. So at least some of the journalists there, from reports I've read, seem to think he paid attention to what happened to Burnham at the Labour conference, where he jumped the gun, and he's trying not to appear too eager. I don't think he's really pulling it off, but it's interesting that, isn't it, that he made a point when he went round the conference talking to people of praising Kemi Badenoch's leadership. Swearing can be a good way of de-stressing, like a pressure valve. See, that's an interesting thing. So my old judo teacher, right, he and I were talking about this one time, And he said he didn't like casual swearing specifically because of what you've just said there. And his rationale was this. So if you've got someone who swears casually, right, they've got no real way of letting you know they're getting angry until they flip their lid, right? Whereas if someone doesn't swear at all, like, for example, I didn't swear as a teacher, right? I did once sort of accidentally, but not because it slipped out, but because I didn't realise it was swearing, right? That's another story. But I didn't like, nothing slipped out during my entire career. But let's say I did swear, like in my class. There would be shock on their faces, and they would think, oh shit, what's going on here? Because they would have to conclude that I was angry, right? And it's a fair point. If you've got someone who just never swears, or you never hear them swear, and then they swear, it's like, ooh, they'll think something's wrong, because it's like anything. I mean, perceptive people can pick up on changes in behaviour and will ask you if there's something wrong, right? But what if you're not perceptive? So my old judo teacher used to think the benefit of swearing, but not casual swearing, was that it's sort of when you are angry or there's something wrong with you, it's sort of a way of communicating that to people before you go too far, so they can sort of, like, you know, calm you down before you get too far in, which is interesting. So anger management, not swearing, is anger management. Pronounce there saying, could we see the Tories bring in Jenrick, realise their mistake, end up replacing him just for Kemi to come back for the general election? So I don't think they'd go back to someone else. But I have suggested, yes. I mean, if I was a Tory MP, although I have said that it makes no sense to replace Badenoch before next May, I would say I would still put my letter in next month, because the way I'd look at it is, if Jenrick's going to win, first of all, I don't mind him getting tripped up by the elections next year, because I'd want him gone as well. I think he'd be just as bad. The problem with waiting is, so if you get rid of Kemi Badenoch next May, say, then she's been in place for, well, I guess a year and a half. It'll be a bit longer because she'll still be in place while the election goes on, unless she steps down and an interim leader's chosen. But she'll have been leader for a year and a half before she's ousted, right? So then if Jenrick comes in, you sort of have to give him a year and a half. And then, you know, by the time you're in that situation and you're having to get rid of him, you're then having to get someone new in. There might only be a year left before the election. Now, that can work to your advantage, but it also means there can be no long-term planning for that election. So, but I don't think they'll ever bring Kemi Badenoch back. If they were going to bring an old leader back, Boris Johnson would be the only chance, but I also don't think that's going to happen. I really don't think. I don't think Tory MPs, to get him back would be very difficult. But I also really don't think Tory MPs want. The impression I get, and it's very difficult, because, you know, like, you'll read little reports, little opinion pieces in newspapers and so on, from people who's been, you know, talking to Tory MPs off the record, and they'll sort of give you an impression of the way Tory MPs are thinking, but you never know whether that journalist is really giving you a general view, or whether they're just giving you the view of literally 3 MPs whose views that you also align with. So you don't really get a good sense of it, unless you know those MPs to talk to, and I don't know any MPs. So, yeah, it's... But I get the impression that Tory MPs don't want Boris Johnson back. And it would be, they'd really have to want him back to get him back, because it'd be very difficult. Do I think Reform have peaked at this point, as they're seeming to get worried about the bribery issue? Farage certainly is. They may have peaked. I'm not going to say they have, because if I think The thing that I think is going to ultimately start to make it harder for Reform UK to hold on to their poll lead is Labour delivery. And in terms of what I think is going to be really obvious delivery, I think we have to wait till 2027 or towards the end of 2026. Maybe in a year's time, there's things that I'll be able to point to that are physical that people cannot deny, right? So it is possible that Reform UK could fall back a little bit over the next few months, but then peak again for the next, I mean, I hope they don't, but they could, in theory, have the better of the elections next. I mean, there's major elections next year. You've got local elections in England, but you've also got national elections in Wales and Scotland. So it's a huge election year. So and the media will relentlessly promote Reform UK, and so will Twitter and Facebook and the Russian bot army. So I'm not going to say they've definitely peaked, but I think there's a good chance they have. But I do see them falling away. I'm not saying the next election will be fine, don't sweat it, because the vote is so fragmented that, I mean, Professor Rob Ford, who is a serious political scientist, one of the top political scientists in the country, I mean, he said himself it's a crapshoot. You know, there are several parties that could go into the next election on enough of a share of the vote to win an outright majority. It's not always the case that the one with the largest share of the vote also is most likely to get the majority. Like, you know, you could have a party that gets 30% of the vote, and you could have a party that gets 28% of the vote, and the party on 28% could actually end up winning the majority. Now, the reason why I would actually maybe have added some nuance there that Ford didn't, might be interesting to talk to him, but he probably won't. I'm rubbish at getting people to talk to me. But what I would add in that is, if you're going to have two parties that get a very similar share of the vote, let's say Labour and the Reform UK, Labour are probably in the best position to maximise the efficiency of the vote. And the reason I say that is, first of all, Labour are used to targeting key voters, and they've got the resources to do it. Reform UK at the moment, I don't think have the resources to do it, but also they don't have the expertise to do it. And Reform UK have benefited for years on a top-down approach. But the thing about a top-down approach to campaigning is it's very scattergun. It's about the national message, but the national message goes everywhere. So it's a bit like the difference between a national message is like you scattering seeds to the wind and hoping they fall on fertile ground, and your targeted messaging, which Labour are used to, right, is, you know, stick in the ground, put a seed in, cover it up thing. Much more targeted. So in a situation, I would say, in a situation where Reform UK and Labour both have enough of a share of the vote to, in theory, win a majority, Labour, I'm not saying it's certain, but Labour, I would argue, are more likely to, because their election methods will be more efficient, because they're better practiced at it. Now, in theory, Reform UK could hire in people who know how to advise them on that. That is true. They could do that. But will they have the money to do it? They might. I hope they don't. At the moment, I don't think they do. But anyway, John there saying, oh yes, very good. The old ones are the best. I promised my 6-year-old niece if she didn't swear for a week, I'd give her a cigarettes back. Yes, very good. Right, well, we'll leave it. On a nicer note to end on, Ukraine is getting more F-16s. There's actually quite a lot of encouraging news if you want to talk about Ukraine, Russia. The most hilarious thing I've listened to this week is the fact that Ukraine have just been listening in on Russian radio for troop movements. So like Russia have been like moving troops about, and not obviously big movement, but small movements, and Ukraine have been ambushing them. And Russia have kept trying to use the same routes, not realising that Ukraine are listening in on their radio. I think they probably know now, because if I know about it, Russia knows about it, right? But obviously for a time they didn't. Vaguely hilarious that they didn't realise that their shit radios were compromised. Not exactly enigma, is it? But anyway, we'll leave it there. Thanks for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of evening, and until next time, I'll see you later.